Got actually a little sweat on my head. I'm somewhere warm right now, ducking the cold weather, and excited to kick the year off here with Edge. So let's just go ahead and get started. We have a power-packed hour here. We have some awesome panelists. We'll be having a very important discussion today. This is a very interesting time that we're in. We've seen a lot of shifts in the world of DEI, and some are even avoiding using the term DEI because it's become a hot button in certain states and certain areas. And, so we have to have a real conversation. We need to talk about DEI and particularly how it pertains to the area of STEM and technology and these growth areas that seem to need more talent, yet there's not as much attention sometimes in trying to find that talent in diverse places and trying to retain the talent and make sure there's inclusive environments and, evaluating things like equity, especially with the digital divide and other challenges that are here. So we're here to talk about that, and we're here to have some real conversation. And so we welcome everybody. And so let's go right into our agenda for today. We can pull up the slides. So today, actually, if you go back one slide. So officially, the title for this event is, future-proofing STEM, right? And that's something I'm putting out there as a posit, and we're going to challenge it, and we're going to figure out if DEI should be a part of future-proofing STEM. Is DEI still relevant in STEM industries in 2024 and beyond? And we have a great group of panelists who I'll be introducing very shortly, but let's go to the agenda. So going to do, we've already kind of done some basic introductions. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking. I want you all to hear from our panelists. We're going to learn some more about what they do, who they are, and the things that they're involved with. And then we're going to talk about some of these key discussion points, the current landscape of STEM and DEI, and what are some strategies and what are some challenges and opportunities. And then we're going to give you all a chance to, along the way, ask some questions that hopefully at the end we can dig into and give the panelists a chance to address those. And then we'll just have a couple closing thoughts and also share some upcoming events and things that we're doing with Edge. Next slide, please. So I don't want to talk about Edge this time. I want the conversation to really determine is Edge relevant? And of course, we represent the geospatial industry and all things mapping, but this conversation will be relevant across across the STEM areas. And I think regardless, it's going to be applicable to what we're about at Edge. So we always like to understand why we're doing the work that we're doing and how important it is and how much it should or shouldn't be a part of a lot of our everyday lives as folks in the industry, as individuals, as companies, as professional organizations. Does this matter to us? Next slide. So again, we're going to just push through here, but I do suggest that everyone check out edgegeospatial.com to get more information about who we are. But I also then want to go to our sponsors who make this possible. We really appreciate all of them. First and foremost, Urban GIS, because Edge is a 501c3 nonprofit and essentially an extension of my company, Urban GIS, and our give back to the community and my personal give back to an industry that's really served me well. But we also love to thank Geo Marvel, who's a platinum sponsor, been so just amazing in terms of pushing DEI, in terms of being supportive of Edge, in terms of putting out great content on YouTube and other places to the industry. So they're a great organization to look to as an example of people who are really corporately responsible. We also love to shout out North Point, one of the founding members of Edge. They've been so critical to our success and our growth, so we always appreciate them and what they do. And then Bolton and Mink, another company that is very dedicated to diversity, equity, inclusion, and is a great example of companies that are not only bringing excellence in geospatial services, but also in DEI. Next slide. And then we have a number of great partnering professional organizations who've been awesome and given us chances to speak at their conventions and their different events, who help to promote what we're doing at Edge. And we love to promote what they're doing and support what they're doing, especially as they're very connected to all things DEI and social justice. So We want to shout out all these different organizations, and this is a chance for other organizations and other companies to be a part of the Edge family. We'd love to have you. We'd love to partner with you, and we'd love to figure out how we can work together. Next slide. So let's go right into today's event. Future Proofing STEM. Is DEI still relevant in STEM industries in 2024? And of course, we always kind of talk about things on the mapping side, but we're going to broaden it out. So I have a star-studded cast here today. I know one of our folks was having a little bit of problems chiming in, but hopefully they will be able to do so if they haven't already. But we have Dr. Danielle Jenkins, who is amazing professional and has done some awesome things in the area of STEM, particularly in working in DEI and social justice into the things that she has been aligned with in her career. We have a longtime Edge professional and one of our consultants, Kevin Squirrel Brown, who's going to share some more about cultural sensitivities and how we can be better positioned as individuals from all walks of life to be a part of the DEI story. And then we have Kevin Nichols, who's a pioneer in STEM, in DEI, in law, and has for a long time been an advocate of these things. And I'll be your host, and I'll be sharing a little bit myself. But really, I want to turn it over to these folks to let you know more about themselves and help them to answer this question that we have before us. So do we have Dr. Danielle Jenkins? Was she able to get fully connected? If so, let's turn it over to her and for her to share. If she's not, okay, maybe we'll come back when she's able to get connected. Let's go to Kevin Squirrel Brown. Kevin, share with us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Keith. Thanks for inviting me to be here with Edge. I'm really excited about the work that Edge is doing in really trying to be in the industry and lead the industry from within, saying that there's to be a GIS company or a STEM connected company, and to do that well, you need to be engaged in addressing diversity and then building inclusion. So my name is Kevin Square Brown. I'm with Cultural Fluency Associates. And at Cultural Fluency Associates, we're really about helping both individuals and organizations be their best selves. And we talk a lot about cultural fluency, and we use the word cultural fluency as opposed to cultural competence. People know about competencies, and those are like skills we learn, and we like, I got that skill, I can do that thing. And we talk instead about fluency, because fluency is for us akin to language acquisition. It's something that's ongoing. And we would define cultural fluency as our ability then to authentically interact across cultural differences in ways that are both responsive and respectful within that given setting. And oftentimes when we think about diversity, we think about it in terms of, in this country, we often think about it primarily in terms of race. I mean, that's the thing that comes up most often for people. And that is an important element of diversity that we need to be addressing, and inclusion that we need to address. But it goes well beyond that. And hope today that we get an opportunity to talk about some of the other ways that organizations are perhaps challenged by and can leverage different kinds of diversity within their workspaces. And so maybe one more slide. And so when we think about building cultural fluency, I really think about cultural fluency as a river. So if cultural fluency is a river, it's a river with two different tributaries. There's two primary ways that we build cultural fluency. And the first of those, the one that most people are most familiar with, is what we'll call the social justice approach. Looking at the isms, looking at differential impacts of inclusion, exclusion, privilege, and oppression. And that's how most people, most of the time, think about and talk about sort of diversity and inclusion. And that's an important component, but it's not the only way we do it. And for me, it's sort of just, it leaves the river less than full. And so if we go on to the next slide, I'll talk just for a moment about sort of these two different approaches. So social justice approach has us looking again at sort of advantages and disadvantages that are built into systemic systems and then reflected in how we engage as individuals. But the other way that most people are less familiar with, and I'm going to ask most of us here on this call perhaps might not be as familiar with, is the intercultural development approach. And the intercultural development approach has us thinking about and looking at how have we as individuals, and each of us in our own sort of individual journey, how have we learned to engage around cultural similarity and difference? How have I learned to think about myself in relation to difference? and think about different groups of people relative to how they're both similar and different from me. And those learned ways of operating tend to become unconscious, and then they're revealed in, reflected in both our individual interactions, but also how we build systems, policies, practices. And so at Cultural Fluency Associates, we bring these two different approaches together in the intercultural development approach and the social justice approach to help both individuals and organizations build more inclusion in their organization. So thank you, Keith.
No, thank you, Kevin. Always interesting concepts, and we hope to weave in some of these discussions around STEM. We know you're not a STEM specialist, but you've worked with a number of organizations, nonprofits, and other folks, and the same questions and concerns, kind of cross industries, but maybe there's some specific things with STEM that we can hear from some folks with a STEM background. So we'll turn it over to the other Kevin on our panel, Kevin Nichols, to share a little bit about himself and his organization and kind of his journey through STEM and law and DEI.
Thank you, Keith. I appreciate the introduction. Why don't we go to the next slide, and I'll walk you through my organization as well as my background and how I got to where I'm at and what I'm doing. And it'll put my organization in context. So basically born and raised here in the Bay Area. Did a lot of math and science courses when I was in elementary, junior high, and high school. Started my career as a mechanical engineering intern at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and that's where I decided that I didn't want to be an engineer anymore. I was pretty devastated, but nevertheless, I thought I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer after that. So I started working in a big law firm, hoping to learn the ins and outs and hopefully work as a civil rights lawyer. But after a couple trials and a couple years there, I decided that I didn't want to practice law either. What I ended up doing, though, was falling back in love with technology and became a specialist in what they call electronic discovery in the big law firm setting. So I spent about 12 years working in big law doing that. I also created diversity programs. Both started out at Lawrence Livermore Lab in the Affirmative Action Diversity Program, as well as starting diversity programs in big law firms. I started my own consulting firm around 2012, and that's where I connected with my business partner, Dr. Brian Brown, who's a professor at the School of Education at Stanford University. And together we've been putting together STEM pipeline programs for young people since about 2016 officially. I'm also the senior diversity integration partner at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, where I help recruit and retain diverse postdoc and PhD talent to work and do research in the national lab system. So that's a synopsis, a little bit about who I am, who our organization is. Ironically, our name is the Social Engineering Project. And social engineering, you think of stealing passwords and doing nefarious things online. Actually, the name comes from a quote from Charles Hamilton Houston, a famous lawyer who laid down the groundwork for the Brown versus Board of Education cases. He said a lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite on society. So we use the name and the quote as you're either part of the problem or part of the solution. Next page. And just very briefly, just to show you some of the programs that we have a week-long day camp at Stanford for 5th and 6th graders called Science in the City. We have an overnight camping conference for high school students. We take them to the Santa Cruz Mountains, and we have tech companies like Apple, GoPro, and Northrop Grumman come up to lead workshops on what they do for a living. And the students learn work-life balance. They go on hikes, they'll do yoga and mindfulness in the outdoors. And we'll teach them about college as well. We have an asset management data science camp that we teach students how to use ESG investing tools, as well as looking at Python and interpreting big data. We have a career mentorship symposium where students learn how to resume write, interview skills, as well as personal branding and networking. And last but not least, we have family science days where we take all of our students and their families to a corporate headquarters of a company, and they get to see what it's like to work at that company for a day, and they have age-appropriate STEM-related workshops all day. So that's our organization in a nutshell, and I'm glad to be a part of this discussion.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Really appreciate it. Some amazing things that you've been doing, and I know you continue to push the envelope, and part of that is having these sort of discussions. So let's go right to that, and let's talk about this. So I'd love to get maybe both of y'all's thoughts on where do you think DEI is overall right now, and And Kevin, obviously, you can speak to it more from a STEM standpoint. Where do you think DEI is in the world of STEM? We'll start with you and then turn it over to Kevin Squirrel Brown to hear about the state of DEI in 2024 as you see it.
Well, unfortunately, it's become a dirty word in certain circles, which is pretty sad and ironic. However, when we talk about it, I think we're missing the point as far as why it was created, why it exists, and why it's necessary. So thinking back, although slavery ended, a couple of hundred years, the laws didn't, and so African Americans particularly have been behind the eight ball, not by their choice, but from structural racism perspective of keeping them back, both legally as well as socially and economically. So these I guess these initiatives that have been created have been put in place to try to rectify that in some shape or form. But even today, we can't even acknowledge that either slavery existed. We're trying to remove the slavery from history books now. We're trying to pretend as though everything is equal and that everyone is coming out the gate at the same position with the same speed and intensity. And so looking at DEI from that perspective gives us at least context as why it exists. Look at, African Americans particularly representing between 12 and 13% of the population in the United States, but only representing 6 or 7% in the tech industry. That's not by chance. That's not even statistically possible. So there are other items working behind the scenes to keep the status quo. And hopefully, in this discussion, we can get a little bit further in as far as, what are some of those roadblocks and how we can unlock them.
I appreciate that. And as we celebrate MLK Day this week, if we're intentional about having this kind of state of the DEI talk every year around this time. Kevin, love to get your thoughts, and particularly I love to get your input. You always have some great insights from a perspective that may be different from a lot of us who are usually passionate about DEI.
Yeah. So I'm gonna build on what Kevin just talked about in terms of the history, because it's important for us to recognize the history. There are folks who say, "Oh, the history is the past," and slavery ended a long time ago. But the mentality that created slavery in this country hasn't gone away, and so and we actually have seen a resurgence of that attitude and that becoming more public. I think about Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King Jr. said many things that we need to pay attention to, but one of the pieces that I've often held on to was this notion of the arc of justice, bends towards equality, towards inclusion. And a few years ago, I was reading Ibram Kendi and had a perspective that I thought was super useful for me. And that was that while there are there's that arc towards increased justice, there's also, Kendi talks about sort of two forces, that there's always been two forces. And one of those forces in this country has been attached to and advocates for and works towards oppression and hierarchy, and it's frankly about white supremacy is what it really is. And that there have been forces of moving towards justice since the early days of slavery, particularly from those who were enslaved and whose land was being taken away, and some white allies. But there's always been forces that are opposed to that. And I think where we are today is that those forces of wanting to re-engage sort of the hierarchy and racial hierarchy have gotten bold, and they've gotten organized in ways that they haven't been for a while. And so I think putting this stuff into law, putting this stuff into policy that says you can't talk about DEI, and we're going to make school books that don't talk about slavery. Those are ways, as Kevin suggested, to erase the history of this country, to rewrite the history of this country. And I mean, one of the places where it intersects with tech is tech's where people get information these days. Tech is where people are reading we're learning about things. And so if the tech industry doesn't keep the narratives alive and isn't equipped with people who understand the narratives and can speak to the narratives, we're all in trouble.
Yeah, I really appreciate those points. And as a geospatial professional, we can look at things like redlining and creating maps, right? And once those sort of institutional and systemic things are put in place, the next generation and the next generation that could have built from some of the wealth, that could have benefited from living in certain areas and having access to certain levels of school, then becomes systemic, and the next generation is behind further. And to your point, I believe that tech is really at the heart of it, because everything we do now is around tech. And so maybe you could both talk about the digital divide, which has been there, but now if we're not intentional about DEI, does that divide even go further and then make everyone that much further behind in almost every area from that perspective?
Yes, I'd say that, the digital divide, we really figured out how divided the divide was during the pandemic. Once the pandemic hit, my organization was faced with the conundrum of A, how do we continue doing programming online? B, will the students have appropriate mechanisms or the technology, computers, laptops, iPads, et cetera, to be able to participate in a virtual environment, and see would they have enough bandwidth as far as Wi-Fi to be able to access the technology quickly and effectively. So these were things that we had to deal with, and we realized that there were disparities where rural cities and rural towns were completely out of it. I mean, there was no infrastructure there for them to be able to utilize the amount of speeds that were necessary in order to learn and participate virtually in programming. So luckily we had some sponsors like First Republic Bank who provided us old laptop computers from their company, since no one was in the office, and allowed us to be able to donate and give laptop computers to students to be able to participate. And also with Comcast and Xfinity, being able to get reduced discounted Wi-Fi rates in order for families to be able to participate and be able to access the technology that was available to them. So that divide still hasn't changed since the pandemic has somewhat moved away. We still have challenges as far as being able to going to schools, and public schools, particularly in certain zip codes that are near tech companies or near wealthy cities, have all the tools and things that they need at their disposal. Whereas if you don't live in these areas, you have to go to either a private school or some type of parochial school in order to be able to be competitive and be able to stay abreast as far as being at the same level, grade level, and have the amenities that you need in order to be successful in STEM. So we definitely have to figure out from an education perspective how to level the playing field so that everyone has the same access to technology, tools, and speeds.
Awesome. Kevin, spur
Yeah.
around.
Yeah. So if I can just add to that, I agree and appreciate all of those pieces. And I would just add, so the equipment is one of the things. So I live in Duluth, Minnesota, for folks online, Duluth, Minnesota, on the Great Lakes, about a couple hours from Canada, middle of the country of the United States. And we have a semi-rural, we have a community, city of about 80,000, but our school district reaches well into our townships. There isn't high-speed internet in a good portion of our school district. And so it wasn't just the equipment. So it was lower income families, and in our community, most of the low income families are white, but by percentage, more people of color are low income in our community than proportionate to the population. And so it was equipment, but it was also then getting internet access. So it was getting hotspots. We're currently still dealing with it in our school district, because families need hotspots in order to get this adequate bandwidth to be able to run some of the equipment. And so and we think, well, the pandemic's done, right? It isn't, because we still have learn at home days. as COVID starts to peak again, as weather has happened across the country this last week, there are schools across this country, at least certainly across the northern part of this country and from the middle going east, that haven't been in class, haven't been in the buildings this week for days. And so being able to have some digital learning opportunities, I think, is one of those places where, again, and this is about access. So this is about access, but it's also about familiarity with the equipment and having the equipment work for the end user. The other piece I would just add when we're thinking about education is how many more students never went back to their brick and mortar schools. The number of students who decided that kind of learning, that social space, sometimes it's because the social space isn't accepting, whether it's because of gender identity, sexual orientation, race, other ways in which they feel marginalized by their school system. More and more students, higher percentage of students, are getting their education online. And then that lands us in tech. Like who's monitoring what they're learning, how they're being treated online, all of that. So again, sort of lots of roads come back to tech in terms of, if we can't create equity in our educational system, then certainly the references that Kevin made to job acquisition and promotion aren't going to move if we can't get people adequately through the educational system.
Great points, gentlemen. Really appreciate what you're sharing. I want to maybe take that and shift it from the educational and kind of access side to decision making and products. So we know that tech and STEM and science are leading the way and influencing the decisions we make, whether that's politicians, whether that's how we react to some of the pandemics and some of the natural disasters. And in GIS and geospatial, we have some great tools. We're in these war rooms, and if we don't have the representation, are we having the right level of conversation for people who can understand, the needs and the concerns of people of diverse backgrounds and having those fluencies that you mentioned, Kevin, and sensitivity. So can you all talk a little bit more about, being able to make sure the products that we're all consuming, and sometimes consuming even more as people of diverse backgrounds and people of color, are we even at the table to influence those products to be, what we're hoping to be purchasing? Are we able to influence these decisions that are made through the minds that are in the STEM and tech industries? Whomever can jump in.
Kevin, you want to start?
Well, I appreciate following you. Go ahead.
Lucky you. Okay. What I would say is, part of the motivation and part of the work that I do particularly is trying to get more African Americans, particularly in the rooms where those discussions and those decisions are being made. I'm sure that most or many of you have heard about different studies, kind of like the Google study, where there were no people of color involved in the designing of facial recognition software that they were using, and were misinterpreting Black people as apes and animals, and because no one was there testing this on darker skin or darker complexion people. And so the bottom line is, obviously, we need to be at the table in the design, and there are some people who are in that space right now that are being very good advocates and making sure that products have people of color in mind, especially because they are predominantly the trendsetters as far as what products are going to jump off the shelves with pop culture, et cetera, but also to be able to determine what that these products are geared for this particular market. It's going to help the companies make more money and generate more revenue and more return for their investors. So it's advantageous for them to be able to have diverse people at the table when they're designing the products. But they're not in the rooms of those conversations, and they're not in senior level executive positions to be able to leverage or cause the company to stop and focus on this. And so that's an area where I think that is greatly needed, and where I hope to invest some of my time, power, and influence in making changes in that area.
Kevin?
Yeah. So I would have us look at that situation where there's a space in which products are being designed and there isn't representation in the room. And I would say two things. One, representation in the room from the folks who are ultimately going to be the consumers, right? It isn't representative enough. And the other piece I would say is that everybody in the room has a responsibility to that company to be thinking more broadly than their own narrow cultural identity. Like, that's an obligation of all employees, and all companies then, to prepare employees to be able to think broader than their own lived experience. And so while I think it's essential that we increase diversity, representation in the room, at the table, it's also incumbent upon folks from dominant culture societies, whether that has to do with, race or biological sex or sexual orientation or religion or class, that they develop the skills to be able to see beyond their own world, so that they can start to both support and respond to, can hear it, but can also start to anticipate and understand other cultural groups of beings in terms of generalizations, not stereotypes, but generalizations, so they can understand how to function more successfully, to be more valuable in their companies, because they're able to both work interpersonally, but also then think more systemically in ways that go beyond their own lived experience. So this is not advocating for representation and participation, because that's essential. But I think too often then people go, oh, the white folks go, oh, good, we got some black folks in the room. They'll come up with whatever we need. Like, they're the ones monitoring that. And that's a problem too. When we get one or two people in the room who seem diverse and we go, okay, so we've got that handled. They're the ones watching out for that, because they're actually, like the rest of us, have another training to be building around, be it design or be it research or be it marketing. So to ask them to do both of those things while the other folks are just focused on their one sort of training is a poor use of organizational assets. Like, everyone has that responsibility in my book.
Yeah, I love that point, Kevin. And that's really what we're about here at Edge, is making it something that we're all collectively a part of. And we know that if we got more oars in the water, we can take this thing much further, and we can all benefit from it. And we all can take some level of responsibility. No one can change what happened in the past, but we can decide what we're doing about today and tomorrow. And to that point, I want to ask, what are some adjustments that organizations can make to put an oar in the water? What are practical things they could be thinking about, that they could be doing, or they could be advocating to answer the question, how is DEI relevant, not just in general, but to their organization? Let's start with you, Kevin Squirrel Brown.
Sure. So when I think about, so what can organizations do? The first piece is to understand their climate and culture. I mean, the first piece is we got to know where we are before we figure out if we need to go somewhere different. And I would say most every company has room to go somewhere different. But that said, you got to figure out where you are. And that can be an organizational assessment. It could be starting to, maybe informally starting to listen a little better, particularly to diverse voices. But there's all kinds of data. I mean, tech companies are probably, right at home with data. What are your interview pools look like? Your hiring processes? Who's making it through your hiring processes? Who's making it through probation? Who's retaining? Who are you losing? I mean, there's data. That's just, HR's got that stuff. If they are willing to disaggregate it, it's not to say we have a turnover rate of 2% a year or whatever percent a year. It's like, but who's leaving? Who's leaving and why? And so the first piece I would say is assessment. It's also for the decision makers to build their muscle. I have a client who talks about we have to build our cultural muscle. Like, we have to build our muscle to be able to be intercultural. And I'll introduce that term. Being intercultural is about being able to see and operate beyond my own cultural framework. How I was raised, how I think the world is, how I experience the world. So doing some assessment at the individual level, at the organizational level is where I would start. There's certainly it's not where it ends. It's like you go to the doctor. The first thing they do is if something, you say, how are you doing? Is anything hurting? Let's take a sample. Let's do assessment before we diagnose and then figure out what the intervention is, what the treatment is. I'll let Kevin jump in, and then perhaps I have some other things downstream a little bit we can talk about.
Keith, I need you to rephrase the question, because I wasn't quite clear on what you were asking. And Kevin did a good job of giving me context, but I don't want to jump in unless I make sure I understand specific?
Yeah, it's somewhat of an open-ended question around how can companies, so those who do say, yes, we think DEI is relevant, yes, something should be done. What does a corporately responsible company in 2024 look like? What are some things they could be doing, should be doing, and what are maybe some examples you've seen in companies and how they've taken it seriously?
Well, as you saw after George Floyd, all these companies were pressured into, well, not even necessarily pressured, they did it on their own, pledged millions of dollars to address social justice issues, inequities and, hiring and salaries, all wage uh, increases and leveling out that. And then after a while, you stop hearing about that. A lot of the money that was pledged never actually made it to where it was supposed to go. And then companies reneged on that, and they've also have started firing people and letting people go. Recently, the Congressional Black Caucus, led by Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who was driving the initiative, sent a letter to, I think it was the Labor Secretary, to talk about the number of people of color, African Americans particularly, who were caught up in the layoffs of the tech industry, disproportionately showing up, last hired, first fired scenario. And so companies really could do a lot better as far as following through on their commitments. I know that there's a lot of political pressure right now to have DEI, or have a department in the company that has a DEI head, or as employees that are doing DEI stuff right now. There's threatened of lawsuits, et cetera, because of affirmative action being banned by the Supreme Court. So there's a very complicated time that we live in right now. But companies need to weather this storm. They need to keep their DEI focus. They need to recognize that they're doing their part, hopefully, not just having activities or events. That's nice. Celebrating, this particular month or that particular month is good, and it builds morale, et cetera, for those individuals, and educates others who don't belong to that protected group or class that are celebrating. But at the end of the day, that's not necessarily moving the needle as far as recruiting and or retaining diverse talent in their companies. So companies need to do a better job of doing outreach. I know that Berkeley Lab has been having these conversations and doing an amazing job of trying to develop strategic partnerships with historically Black colleges and universities and other institutions that have minorities attending, to be able to attractively recruit them to work and do research in a national laboratory. And they have to compete with companies who have enormous salaries, stock options, et cetera, but at the same time can do that because they have stability. There's not as much turnover, other than the fact that the government may be shut down on occasion. But other than that, we don't, working for the federal government or doing research and working at an academic institution doesn't have the same volatility as the tech industry has. So just, those are just some ideas that come off the top of my head.
Yeah, appreciate that. And of course, as we know, a lot of states and universities and organizations have removed their DEI departments, and they're kind of almost saying we don't really see the benefit, which is challenging because we all know that there is a lot of benefit to the bottom line. But maybe let's talk about some of the liabilities. What are some things that people might be missing that are liabilities if people are not intentional about this and don't take it seriously? Because it does take money, it does take, going out of your way. But what are some things, what is opportunity costs, or what are some liabilities that could be associated with not looking at DEI and social justice issues seriously within your professional organizations as well as companies? Maybe we'll start again with Kevin Squirrel Brown.
Sure. So I really appreciate what you're saying, Kevin, about not just activities and events. So I'm going to take a little bit and then we'll move into the next thing about thinking about meaningful activities. I mean, meaningful action as opposed to just activities and events, because too often that's the way DEI has been treated, as sort of what month is it? Okay, so now it's, Cinco de Mayo. So now we're going to do this, but there's no meaningful action to move the needle, as Kevin says. And so, and I lost your follow-up question. The
Around
liabilities.
liabilities.
Yeah, the liabilities. So, I mean, the example that comes to mind most readily for me is Starbucks. I mean, who doesn't know what happened at Starbucks when they called one of their managers or one of their, store personnel called the police on two Black folks who are in their store waiting for their, buddy to show up so they could order their coffee and have a coffee together. That kind of implicit and sometimes explicit bias costs companies. It also costs companies when BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and or people who are marginalized in other ways, gay, lesbian folks don't feel at home, don't feel comfortable, don't feel welcome or valued in a company, leave. It happens when generational stuff, when the older guard, literally aged older guard, can't adapt to and work with younger folks who have a different sense of sort of how many hours am I employed for and how many hours will I spend at the job? I mean, there are very different notions of sort of work-life balance and how many hours of overtime is just sort of expected without being acknowledged or compensated. All of those are cultural differences. So if companies think they can operate without dealing with cultural difference, they're really silly. I mean, that's just not realistic. Cultural difference exists in every company. So you may not label it for the same reasons people did, or may not feel driven to it. Like after George Floyd was murdered, there was that upsurge. Like lots of folks got on board. And I think in some ways that was a reaction that we should have expected to swing back to a different place. If folks understand, if people in charge, whether it be of a team or a department or a division or a whole organization, recognize diversity exists within our organization. And if we learn to leverage it, as opposed to make it uncomfortable, then as the company, you benefit. I mean, the data is there that diverse groups of people are more innovative, diverse teams are more innovative than homogeneous teams. And if tech isn't about innovation, then sort of where is innovation at home if it isn't in the tech industry? And so I think sometimes we get locked into ways of justifying things and getting afraid of things. But this has always been a good idea to help teams work better together, to help organizations work better together, to help organizations be more welcoming to a broader spectrum of potential employees. Because the number of qualified, highly qualified folks, my understanding is that number, that there's more opportunity than there are qualified folks. So do you want to be the company who can't attract people from certain segments, or do you want to be the company where people from across a number of segments are attracted to, want to go to, feel seen, and want to put their energy into? I mean, that's the question leaders of organizations need to be asking themselves.
Yeah, awesome, guys. I think this is a good time for us to transition to maybe taking on some comments or questions from the audience. So if our folks who are administrating things can tease some of those up. And also Dr. Danielle Jenkins, who couldn't join us in this one, we look forward to having her at an upcoming Agile. We plan on doing one maybe in March around women and women in STEM and geospatial and all those great things. So she could join us then. But if she is joining us from LinkedIn Live, if you want to give us a comment or we could read a statement that you might bring from there, we'd love to represent you on this particular one. But we're going to go with our first question now, coming from, I think it's Caressa Irvin, if I'm saying the name correctly. How do we continue the history, quote unquote, conversation without creating and furthering the us/them narrative that exists? Am I following up on the earlier discussion? So either one of you all can jump in on her question.
Well, thank you for the question. Thank you for the question. What I would say as far as, we just have to make a decision. We have to decide whether we're going to bury our heads in the sand and pretend like the past that hasn't happened or occurred, or we're living in reality. And I think that's the courage that it's going to take in order to have the conversation about history. I mean, there's no dispute what history was and is and what the facts are. So it's a matter of whether or not we can speak about things and agree to disagree on other things intelligently or not. And so as far as I think that DEI practitioners and individuals in general are going to have to get a thicker skin as far as being able to have frank, open-ended conversations and have the confidence to be able to speak intelligently about that with facts, but also sticking to your guns and not kowtowing because whatever political pressure or whatever social discussions that are taking place. And if people get offended, I think that that's on them, not necessarily something that you're going to, if you navigated trying to please everyone, you would not be able to be your authentic self. So I think we just need to have frank conversations. And as grown people, we learn how to adjust and move on.
Appreciate that. And Kevin, you know, I always love that you can come from it in an honest and open way as a white man and as someone who self-acknowledges some level of privilege that comes with that. What are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I certainly agree with Kevin that there's a making a decision. And when I talk to leaders of organizations, I'll often say, and at some point you got to decide, you know, are you committed to being an inclusive organization? And there may be people when you move in that direction who say this place isn't for me, because all of this notion of needing to attend to and be aware of and be responsive to and sort of recognize that other people have legitimate ways of operating in the world, that's just not me. The piece I would offer, though, that I think can sometimes be useful in this comes from that intercultural development approach, which I referenced earlier. The intercultural development approach allows us to understand sort of what is our basic response to. And the problem with the history conversation is that we're operating from one of those orientations, which is called polarization, right, wrong, good, bad. And when we think about the history of white supremacy in this country, slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, social work. I mean, you know, we think about policing, you know, I'm not a police officer, but I'm a social worker. I'm a licensed social worker. And social worker has done all kinds of awful things to folks in this country who are Black and brown. And so it isn't one unit of society that's perpetuated this. It's across society. So I'm not singling anybody out when I talk about this, but we come to this from a polarized place, right, wrong, good, bad. And if we and when people are operating in that space, frankly, we're not open to hearing about anything beyond what our set perspective is. So we can be talking at each other, but we're really not talking to each other. So one of the things about the intercultural model is it helps us recognize when we're in that space, and any of us can get into that space. There are certain topics that pull me, that sort of trigger me into that right, wrong space, but it's not particularly productive for me if I'm trying to make change. The other space that we can then operate in, which is sort of the one that is kind of referenced like, oh, let's not talk about history. We're all the same. Let's pretend like history didn't happen and racism isn't real and sexism doesn't exist. And that's that space where we don't talk about difference. And that's got its own problems, of course, right? It makes it, the water's calm on the top, but everything's stirred up underneath because people are being oppressed and they're not being seen for that. But the third option, and we learn about the intercultural model and we start to build our intercultural skills, we move into this third space, which is about being able to recognize cultural difference, see ourselves relative to it, and see how to respond effectively with people based on where they are on this process. So when people are in that polarization place, I can go head to head and toe to toe, but all I end up with the day is a hoarse voice and maybe a sense of righteousness. But I haven't moved anybody. If instead I can strategically engage that person and think about how do I move someone who's in polarization strategically, I engage them and start having them think about similarities. I think about where is there commonality between the us and the them. And as much as that middle ground is a hard place for us to think about being when we really want to be way over here in this intercultural space, it's the next step for folks. And so I think about this question of the history question is just one of many questions that's got thrown into the polarization approach. And if we can get if we get ourselves and then get other people out of that polarization approach, we have a better chance of having fruitful conversations. It's slow work though. And I recognize for folks who experience the oppression on a daily basis, it's hard to be patient. So I'm not, and I don't know any better way to get people to move than to work with them, to get them one step at a time to get to this other place. So I'll pause and.
Well, we appreciate that. And I want to give you a little time at the end to help some folks know how they can work with you, because I believe the work that you're doing is very powerful and impactful. And also, Kevin, I want to allow people to know about how they can work with your organizations and support the work that you're doing. So let's get one more quick question, and then we're going to wrap it up. So kind of a follow-up on what you just were sharing. So how do we have interculturally skilled folks at our companies? She says, I like the idea of adding representation of BIPOC and also helping everyone to learn to think beyond their worldview. But how do we do this?
Kevin, do you want to start with that one?
Yes, I'll start with it. And part of it, the answer to that is, actually, I'm going to highlight some things that we're doing at Berkeley Lab, which is pretty awesome. One thing is we have a program called Equity Reset, which allows different members of the lab to be able to participate in a 3 to 4 week journey on an equity topic, whether it's implicit bias or racism or sexism or something like that. They'll be assigned readings, there'll be some video homework and that kind of stuff, and then there'll be every, I guess, first Friday for the month for 3 months or something like that, they will be like a 2.5 to 3 hour in-depth session of discussing the topic, discussing the homework, and being in small groups, grappling with some of the curriculum, which I think is fantastic. And you can search that on Google. Also, one way of trying to address getting buy-in and actually moving the needle on having conversations like this are what we've done is created stewardship values. A couple years ago, we came up with some values we wanted the company or the organization to embrace, like team science, leadership, some other like values that we came up with. And with these values, we kind of implement DEI focused outcomes within the stewardship values. And so we're having a stewardship summit coming up. We have about at least a couple hundred employees that are going to be participating in this and learning more about these values and how it shows up in their day-to-day life and day-to-day work. Well, what it does is it's a non-direct way of dealing with equity and other issues through a lens that's not adversarial. So you're not automatically defensive. If we're talking about one of the values is respect, well, how respect shows up and manifests itself is so different. And how you draft an email or correspond with someone, how you show up on time for a meeting, or how you exchange pleasantries and are being kind to someone, or being patient and not interrupting them when they're talking. So these things, you don't have to be black, white, or a woman or transgendered in order to be able to be offended. If you learn how to be respectful, it doesn't matter what I look like or how I show up. So dealing with one another through these values allows you to be able to tackle the problem without creating a barrier with the hierarchical problem that exists. And I'll shut up and allow Kevin an opportunity to say something before we
wrap up. Yeah, fantastic. A couple great programs. And I would sort of putting those in the context of those two streams that I talked about. So that equity reset to me sounds like from the social justice thing, understanding about implicit bias, understanding, and it comes a little bit of the intercultural stuff, but it's understanding how we operate in the realm of the societal forces, racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. So it's that piece. The other piece I heard though is about take those stewardship values example, Kevin. I heard do the learning in a context that isn't emotionally charged. It wasn't exactly the words you used, but that was the notion I picked up. And that's part of the intercultural journey. So part of the intercultural journey is that there are intercultural skills and they operate across things that are highly charged, but they operate in all kinds of difference. And so we can build some of those skills, those intercultural skills. And there are, frankly, intercultural skills. Even you mentioned respect and time, and I think, and there's more than one way to think about time. Like, some people start the meeting on the minute, and some people, that's not how meetings start. That's not culturally how meetings start. And respect is carried differently. So I appreciate those discussions around respect and time. I'm hoping that they are not just, here is what respect is, here's the list, but what does respect look like for you? Because that's the intercultural question. Asking people, what does respect look like for you? The other piece that's something that, just to tie into the other question, I want to just let people know that the intercultural model also has an assessment tool that's highly regarded, valid and reliable, tested and cross-cultural, that helps people understand how they're operating as a default. And so that's one of the assessment pieces that I just put out there, because this can feel like loosey-goosey kind of work for people who are engineer types. It's like, well, wait a minute, you're talking feelings and how you're measuring that. And so there is actually a tool called the Intercultural Development Inventory that allows people to have an assessment as to how they're operating with regards to their approach for engaging around cultural similarity and difference. Not as an always, but as a default. So I put that out there for folks listening who are a little more interested in that. You can learn more about that through IDI LLC. IDI LLC. That's the website for the folks who own the IDI. You have to get the work done through a certified, qualified administrator of the IDI. It's not something you just go do on your own, but it's a place that people could look to. There's administrators across the country and across the world, and it can be done remotely. So a variety of ways there.
Thank you so much for that. And I know we're coming up right to the end here. I'm going to give you guys, another 30 seconds to just kind of wrap up and let folks know how they can work with you, and any other final thoughts. But let me just go through a couple events that we're going to have coming up. So definitely everyone stay tuned for next month, Black History Month. We're going to talk about Black people in mapping and the history and the future. And so that's going to be an exciting webinar that you don't want to miss. And you can go to our website for more information on that, and you can join our LinkedIn group and find out there. We also want to let you know one of our great sponsors, Geo Marble, they have some positions out on our job board. So we do have a job board on edgegeospatial.com. So if you're someone who's looking, you can put your resume, you can check out opportunities that are there, and we're inviting more companies to promote and post their jobs there to attract the diverse talent. Next slide. We also will be at the Federal GIS Conference. We'll be doing some cool events with Esri YPN. Appreciate all their support, and look forward to meeting any of you all who will be at that event. Next slide. We also love to shout out some of the various engineering conferences that are out there. This is where you can find some great STEM talent. So there's BEA in Baltimore. That's the Black Engineer of the Year Awards. It's something I went to when I was in college, and I was looking for companies to hire me. So trying to help expose these places where you can find great folks, network, and then folks of color, we can come together and talk about solving some of these problems and how we can facilitate and support one another. Next slide. And a similar, then we've got the Esri Partner Conference. So we'll be there as well, and look forward to meeting with a number of Esri partners and Esri representatives. And then a really big one here. This is near and dear to my heart. Another conference convention I used to go to all the time when I was a college student. This is the National Society of Black Engineers convention in Atlanta, Georgia. So I will be there at that as well. But in particular, this is their 50th year anniversary. So they have been trailblazing for a long time. And so definitely want to support them and shout them out and what they're doing. Next slide. And as always, we ask you to jump on our website, engage the job board, look at, we have some ways where we're trying to do partner to partner, peer to peer kind of business diversity things. We're building a community board where you can go on LinkedIn and also on our website, share about different opportunities, events. We're just trying to build a platform where we can all work together and share great information and move the needle here. So let's just give one more, and you can use this right here to scan and get information on all things Edge. Let's give each of our panelists who've done a great job today a quick, 30, 45-second close out on any thoughts and any ways that people can work with you, and any just kind of parting ideas you want to leave. let's go back to the panelists if we could real quick. Jump in, whoever's ready to go.
Always ready to share my information. You can connect with me at thesocialengineer.org. That's our website for my nonprofit organization. And for some of the information that I referred to regarding Berkeley Lab, you can visit diversity.lbl.gov. And you can find out information about our Stewardship Summit, Equity Reset, and other programs and initiatives that we're working on. Thank you.
Thank you. Kevin?
And I can be reached through, my email is kevin@culturalfluencyassociates.com. And so be happy to take follow-up questions, inquiries at my website.
Well, once again, we want to thank you both. Awesome information. For those who missed this live, you can share it with folks that'll be on our YouTube site. And definitely we encourage that we spread this information. We keep this as an open dialogue and discussion. If nothing else, we all learn and become better from that. So thank you so much for joining us for the January EDGNR. We look forward to have you on the next ones. And thank you again, panelists, for joining us.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.